All right, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all having a good week. My name is Mariana, and I'm a program director at Chatteris Educational Foundation. And today we will be talking about academic choice, one of the responsive classroom approaches to teaching and learning. Right, and first of all, I will introduce the responsive classroom approach to teaching. And after that, we will talk about the benefits of the academic choice strategy and the importance of student choice and student autonomy in the classroom. And finally, we will look at how to structure a lesson or an activity using the academic choice approach. All right, so the responsive classroom approach to teaching began in 1981 with a group of public school teachers in the US. So their main goal was to resolve the disconnect between the teacher's desire to deliver excellent lessons and what was actually happening in the classroom. They're not the same things. So they realized that academic and social learning go hand in hand. They noticed that the optimal learning takes place when teachers teach academic subject, academic content at the same time as they teach social skills. So they put together a list of strategies that integrate academic and social emotional learning that can be used both inside and outside the classroom. And here are some of the key strategies. So rule creation, logical consequences, guided discovery, positive teacher language, and academic choice. And this is what we will be focusing on today. Okay, so academic choice is a strategy for structuring lessons and activities. It doesn't matter whether you teach English, history, or science, you can always incorporate some options for students to choose from into your lessons. So typically, when teachers start planning lessons, they start by setting lesson objectives. And then after that, they usually design a set of activities for all students to complete in lessons. When you use the academic choice strategy, instead of designing one set of activities for students to use, teachers design a list of options for students to choose from. So students can choose what they want to learn and how they want to learn in order to achieve the lesson objective. This strategy has a lot of benefits. And first of all, by offering students options in the lesson, teachers can accommodate different learning styles, and they can provide students with opportunities to engage with the content in a way that actually suits their personal style, learning styles and preferences and their strength. And we hear people talk about learner diversity and catering to learner diversity and catering to student differences all the time. It's very often talked about, but actually it's not a very common practice. And the academic choice strategy can really help you make a difference for your students in the classroom. Another important benefit of this strategy is that it helps to foster student self-determination. Research shows that students or people in general who have personal sense of control over what they're doing, and in case of classroom teaching, when students have personal sense of control what they're doing in the classroom, that helps increase their self-motivation. So by giving students options on what they can do and how they can engage with content in the lesson can really help you engage more learners and and motivate them to be more proactive and more engaged in lessons. And when I share this strategy with teachers, very often teachers tell me, "Well, I already give my students options. Yesterday, I allowed my students to choose a partner, they can work with for the final activity, or I allowed my students to choose an animal they had to present for their speaking lesson." And of course, teachers already naturally give students a lot of options and a lot of choices in their lessons. What sets the academic choice strategy apart, that here students engage in a whole cycle of planning, working, and reflecting. And they have choices of not only what to learn, but also how to go about their learning. And I will explain it in more detail how it actually works in practice. So we will start with the first phase, planning. So after the teacher introduces, the lesson objectives, the topic of the lesson, then students have to plan what they are going to do and how they will do it. So the academic choice strategy provides two kinds of options, two kinds of choices: what to learn, so content choices, and how to learn, process choices. Let me show you a few examples here. So for example, in terms of content choices, what to learn, instead of selecting one book for all of your students to read in your reading class, you can allow your students to choose a storybook that they want to learn. You can allow your students to choose the topic that they want to discuss for your speaking classes, or choose a topic to research for your public speaking presentation classes. Choose some words that they're interested in or curious about to explore the meanings of those words. In terms of process choices, how to learn, you may have some confident writers in your class, and they may actually prefer to write a summary, for instance, of what they have learned or read about in class. You may have several confident public speakers in your class, so those might choose to actually give an oral summary. And as our warm-up activity shows, a lot of people who joined the session today would rather give a short speech than write anything. And you may have those type of learners in your class as well. You may have some shy students or some more creative students who would prefer, for example, to create a picture book or write a song or a poem. And we should accommodate those preferences and those learning styles where possible in our lessons. So right now, I will provide you a few more specific examples of choices that you could give to your students for different types of lessons, like grammar-based lessons, speaking or reading lessons, or vocabulary-based lessons. The first one, for example, is a grammar lesson. So imagine that the main objective of the lesson is to is for students to be able to correctly form and use the past simple tense to describe completed actions in the past. So it really doesn't matter what they talk about, in the lesson, or how they achieve that goal. What matters is that by the end of the lesson, your students can use the past tense correctly. So for this one, since what they are working on or what they're talking about isn't very important to achieve the lesson objective, you can actually give them several what options, content options. So for example, you can allow your students to talk about what they did last weekend. You can ask your student to share their most interesting childhood memory, or you can ask them to share their thoughts about a movie or a book that they have watched or read recently. In terms of process options, you can allow your students to, for example, prepare a short oral presentation and present it to the class. You can allow students to choose to write a blog post. Or some people prefer to work with a partner. They feel more confident working in pairs or working in small groups. So you can allow students to work together and to prepare a dialogue and role play it in front of the class as well. So as you can see, they can mix and match. They can choose one option. They can choose the topic of their discussion from the what list of options. They can choose how they're gonna go about their learning from the process list of options. So they can mix and match different options. And it really doesn't matter what they end up doing. What matters is, regardless of what options they choose, every student will be able to practice using the past simple tense to talk about actions in the past. All right, let's look at another example. Imagine you're teaching a reading lesson. So at the Chatteris Educational Foundation, actually not many of our tutors teach grammar, but a lot of our tutors teach reading lessons. So let's say your main lesson objective is for students to be able to demonstrate comprehension of a book by reading it independently, identifying key details, and making inferences. So here, you may not want to allow students to choose absolutely any book, right? You may have some course objectives set for the semester or for the year. You know, what type of books they should be able to comprehend, what type of themes or topics you want to explore that year. And that's absolutely fine. In that case, you can make a list of suitable storybooks, suitable books for them to choose from. And again, very often I hear teachers talking about, oh, how do I motivate my students to read? My students don't want to, read books. They never read, the books that I assign to them to read at home and things like that. Well, very often students don't want to read because they're not interested in the book. Such a simple answer, but ask your students why they didn't read it. Very often they're just not interested in the book. So allowing them to choose the book, even from a limited list of books, I think will make a big difference. And I know that some people don't have that flexibility. I know that some schools have very rigid curriculum and actually already have a list, a pre-selected list of books that all students have to cover. But where possible, perhaps you can discuss this, with your school team and see whether there is any flexibility. Or maybe you can incorporate, this academic choice strategy into the reading lessons that are not based on like the school curriculum, for example, and see if it makes a difference. Maybe even for your extracurricular clubs, and see if by giving students choice to choose a story to read, even if it's a short story, whether it makes a difference, whether more students actually complete the task. And then in terms of the process options, there are so many options, you can give students here. But for example, you can allow students to create a book ad, right? You can allow students to act out their favorite part of the story, their favorite part of the book. You can allow students to role play an interview with the main character. Or again, if you have a quieter student who would rather focus and work on the activity on their own, that's completely fine. You can allow them to write a sequel to the story or write a summary of the story if you specifically want to focus on the comprehension of the key details here. And not only that, by giving students these options, experience and research shows that students are more motivated and more engaged in the lesson activity, but also the final stage of the lesson, it's always so much fun, because then you don't have all students just talking about the same book when the information gets so repetitive, and then answering the questions becomes so repetitive. You have different individual students or different groups of students presenting something completely different, posters, role plays, or even reciting, or sharing their summaries or sequels to a story. And you will notice that a lot more students will actually be paying attention to what's going on in the classroom. Because very often, closer to the end of the lesson, you can see students' attention span and their energy level going down. But actually with this strategy, you see students being curious about what kind of choices their classmates have made, what they're going to be presenting, because every presentation, every team has something different to share. All right, and I'll skip this one for now. And then imagine you're teaching a speaking lesson, and let's say your main objective is for students to be able to express agreement and disagreement. And of course, using the appropriate language and appropriate strategies. So in terms of content options, let's say you want to have a little bit more fun here. You don't want them to just select a topic that they're interested in. what you could do, you could get each student or a pair of students or a team of students to write a topic on a piece of paper, put them all in a box or in a hat or in a bag, and then get different teams or different students to select, a topic that they will have to discuss. So that way, it's still student-led. It's still you are still giving student autonomy, but you are adding this level of excitement because they are not they don't know what topic they will have to discuss for the main activity. In terms of the process options for speaking lessons, again, there are so many different ways you can go about this. For example, especially with some secondary school students and some more proficient students, I definitely have had, and I definitely know quite a few students who are very confident speakers, and they actually really enjoy like structured debates. They get very competitive, they get very excited. So some students may actually choose to have like a structured team debate to discuss the topic and practice, agreeing and disagreeing. Some students may not really enjoy that competitive element of a debate, still would like to work with their classmate, but maybe just a pair of students having a dialogue, maybe just discussing the topic. Again, using the same language, practicing the same skills, agreeing and disagreeing. You may have a student who is just not feeling like working with anybody that day, not in a pair, not in a team. And that's also completely fine. You can give them a statement and ask them to give an impromptu speech, either agreeing or disagreeing with that statement. And again, yes, it's not a conversation, it's not a debate, but they can still practice the language for agreeing and disagreeing, and they can still practice speaking. So technically, the lesson objective for that student will also be achieved. So once again, it really doesn't matter at the end of the day how students achieve those lesson objectives. What matters is that they do achieve them by the end of the lesson. And a final example that I have here is about a vocabulary-based lesson, or maybe a vocabulary-based section of a lesson or a series of lessons, depending on your school curriculum. But imagine that the lesson objective is for students to be able to demonstrate an understanding of the target vocabulary words by identifying and using them in context. So let's say for this one, I do not want to give any content options, because let's say I specifically want all of my students to choose on a pre-selected list of 10 words, right? I do not want them to choose any other words. I want them to specifically focus on these 10 words because these are the words that will be tested on their final exam. And that's completely okay. It doesn't mean that you always have to give what and how options. Sometimes you can only give what options or only how options, depending, again, on the flexibility of your school curriculum, depending on the lesson objectives, and even your own choices and preferences as a teacher. So let's say for this class, I do not give them any content options. Everybody is focusing on the exact same vocabulary. Some students may be really tired, again, depending on the class, depending on the learner preferences, and they may simply want to just have a little bit of peace and quiet and focus on a worksheet. Simple, old school, matching or gap fill exercise. And that's completely fine. We have so many of these worksheets, and these days, everything is easily available online as well. So it's not a problem to provide one for your student. Some students really don't like those worksheets. And actually, sometimes I see students just going through those worksheets in like 30 seconds, completing them so quickly. So they may actually enjoy creating their own sentences. And sometimes you see students being funny, being silly, incorporating the target vocabulary, but creating some silly stories. And then they enjoy sharing them and everybody is having a good laugh. So why not allow them to do that? Some students, again, you may have some drama kings and queens in your class, people who enjoy role playing, people who enjoy public speaking. So you may actually allow them, to prepare a longer short story, or to even present something or role play something in front of the class. All right, and again, as I've mentioned already several times here, we should keep this in mind as teachers, that there are many, many different ways for students and teachers themselves to achieve the same objective. It's not only one way, there are many different ways and many different options to explore. And where possible, where applicable, we do encourage teachers to give students those options to choose from, to cater to their different learning styles, to also give them a little bit more power and a little bit more autonomy over their learning, and engage them and kind of get them to be more active learners rather than passive learners, simply following their teacher's instructions. And as I've also mentioned, you may not always want to or have an opportunity to give them both types of options, both types of choices, and that's completely okay. Feel free to only give them content or only process options if that's what you prefer. For this one, no need to share. No need to unmute your microphone. I can see that people perhaps a little bit tired. I'm being very understanding of that as well. But I do want you to take a minute or two to reflect. I will not be asking you to share in the chat box. I will not be asking you to share it with everyone orally, but I do really want you to take a moment to reflect. Think about a lesson that you have taught recently. What was the main objective of the lesson? What skills were students practicing? How did you structure that lesson? What were the main activities in that lesson? And how could you have adapted that lesson using the academic choice strategy? And I will give you 2 minutes to reflect. Again, if you feel comfortable, please feel free, to share in the chat box or mute yourself and share, but I'm not asking people to share at this stage. Now we are going to move on to the next stage. So after you have provided students with options and they have selected the content choices, they have selected the process choices. So the students have already decided what they want to learn and how they're going to go about learning. Now it's time for them to actually complete the task. So you will need to set a time frame. Actually, I forgot to mention then that I think it's important to mention how much time they will have at the beginning of the lesson, because the time frame may actually affect their choice. Depending on how much time you have, they may choose a different option as well. During this working stage, like any kind of project-based learning lesson, your task as a teacher is to monitor, to make sure all the students are on task, to listen for any errors in target, language or sentence structures, to take notes of those, to reflect on those errors and provide feedback to either individual students or as a whole class at the end of the lesson, and overall assess the progress either individually or as groups, depending on how they chose to work on the task. And then after they are done with the task, there is the final reflection stage. And there are several ways you can go about reflecting. So you could, of course, ask students to share their work, right? So you can ask students, individual students or groups of students, to take turns to share what they have been working on, and either show their posters, give their speeches, role play their dialects, or whatever they chose to work on. Because that will benefit them, because that will allow them time to practice, but it will also benefit other students because they will learn more about the classmates' strengths. They will also be exposed to different ways to go about the learning. So maybe after watching some other students engaging in a very different type of task, next time they will choose a completely different option. If you don't have time for that, or if you don't want to have like a whole class kind of presentation, you could choose an an individual reflection activity where students reflect through journal writing or self-evaluation of their work. It's very important here to, especially the first couple of times you test this strategy, to provide them with a list of guiding reflection questions, because we really want them to reflect on the choices that they made. Why did they make those choices? Are they happy with their choices now that they have seen that other students made different choices? If they could do this activity all over again, would they choose the same options? And I think that can tell you a lot. Or next time, if they have a similar lesson again, would they choose the same options or different? What went well for them? What didn't? And these kind of questions, they will help you understand your students better, but more importantly, help your students understand themselves better. Because very often students don't know what their learning styles are, right? Young students don't think about it. They like what they like, they're good at it, what they're good at, and that's it. But actually asking them these questions and asking them to reflect on this and think about that, I think can really help them understand where their strengths are. And I think it's important for learners to be aware of their own strengths. All right, and now we're going to look at a lesson structure. So here is a simple lesson template that you could use to incorporate the academic choice strategy. So of course, it all starts with the lesson objective on the top, but then you should include any content choices, if you have any, process choices, if you have any, and then you have the plan, work, and reflect sections. For the planning section, you need to decide how are students going to be signing up. So yes, you allow students to choose, what to learn and how to go about their learning. Let's say you have these options on the slide, like I did. But as a teacher, you need to monitor their progress. You need to be able to provide them feedback on their work. And to be able to monitor their progress, you need to know exactly what options they chose. So how are you going to be monitoring that? Are you going to be asking them to just sign up orally to tell you what they're working on? Are you going to pass around like a sign-up sheet and ask them to tick the boxes, to tick the options that they have selected? Are you going to help students kind of select a good fit choice based on your understanding of their strengths? Or are you going to allow them to learn it by making their own mistakes? The second section is the working section. And here you also need to think about a few factors prior to the lesson. So you will have probably students choosing very different options, right? So for instance, some students will be working independently on worksheets or some writing tasks. Some students will be working in groups and debating or discussing or role-playing something. So you will need to think about how you will organize your space, right? Will the students remain in their seats to work on their tasks? Will you divide the class into two sections, like a quiet space for any kind of written projects and a space for any kind of speaking assignments? So you need to think about it, how you will go about space in your classroom, and also about pairing. So if students chose to debate or role play, then will they be allowed to choose their own partners, or will you assign people to work together? So small things like that need to be considered before the lesson. And then we have the reflection stage. And here, as we just touched on, you will need to decide how you will go about your reflection. Will students reflect independently with a partner, as a whole class? Will they take turns to present their work, or just use like kind of a reflection journal? And finally, it's extremely important for you as a teacher to reflect as well. what worked and what didn't. Do you want to use this strategy again, or maybe it didn't work for you, which is also completely fine, especially if it's your first time using this academic choice strategy. It's extremely important that you take some time to reflect after the lesson. And when you're reflecting, of course, you can reflect on your own planning as a teacher. Did I prepare for the lesson well? Did everything in terms of logistics work out the way I wanted it to? Or should I consider some other factors next time? But it's also important to reflect on your students and their choices as well. So that's why it helps to have their choices written down. So perhaps maybe you have like a sign-up sheet, or maybe once they start working on their tasks, you can walk around and take notes of what exactly they're working on. So that way, that will really help you to get a better understanding of your students' learning styles, of their preferences, of their strengths, by kind of analyzing their choices. And that will also help you adapt your future lessons to cater to your students' learning styles. What's interesting, that it doesn't mean that your every single lesson has to follow this strategy. Actually, I would never do it myself. Whatever strategy you choose, it becomes repetitive if you do it all the time. But sometimes, depending on the lesson, depending on the topic, they can really make a big difference for your students. Sometimes it's very good to use this type of lesson, use this strategy at the beginning of the school year as kind of a test for your students, for you as a teacher to assess their preferences and their strengths. So after you deliver this lesson and after you reflect, again, you will know your students' learning styles a little bit better. And even if you choose not to continue using this strategy moving forward, you can use, that knowledge that you have gained about your students from that one lesson to adapt your future lessons and better cater to their preferences and their strengths. All right, let's see, what do we have? We have sufficient time for us to practice, and I really hope for your participation this time. But don't worry, you will have a few options to choose from. I will not be asking you to unmute yourself and present. It will be an option, but it's all up to you to decide how you want to go about this activity. So first of all, you will have some content options. So you can choose to prepare a brief summary of what you have learned about the academic choice strategy. You can choose to discuss the pros and cons of the academic choice strategy, or you can choose to provide an example of an activity that you have used or maybe are planning to use with your students, where you can incorporate the academic choice strategy. So you have 3 different options to choose from, and you also have 3 process options. So you could raise your hand, your Zoom hand, and once selected, unmute your microphone and simply share, your answer. And at the beginning of the session, quite a few people said that they enjoy public speaking. So I really expect to see a few hands now. Or you can choose to scan the QR code and join the Jamboard and share your thoughts anonymously. Or you can share your ideas in the chat box for everybody to read. So you have several content and several process options to choose from. And I will give you 5 minutes to work on this task. So let's see what we have. We usually ask students to individually write book reports with my FPO classes, and I'll have the objective. What is your opinion? Students can choose to. Okay, so you already give your students options to choose from. They can typically make a video. Oh, very interesting. I didn't even include that one as an example. Be characters from the book, fantastic. Role-playing as characters, interviewing characters, and writing a newspaper article, writing a poem. These are very creative and very advanced options, I would say. So I imagine a lot of your students can speak English quite well, and it's amazing to see that you give them such creative options to choose from. I can imagine it's a lot of fun for students at the end of the lesson or at the end of the project to listen to the teams, to the classmates presenting, and to see what different students chose to do for their project. Fantastic. Chelsea said that she has a reading activity coming up next week, and she's thinking that the students would appreciate the opportunity to present a summary of their story. However, after the session today, she is also considering to incorporate some options so she can allow them uh, to create a podcast, perhaps. Oh, summarizing the book. That's an interesting one. Yes, creating a podcast or recording the summary, or maybe a writing task or creating an artwork. And that's a very important point here that I also want to raise, that when you think about the options, it's important to incorporate options that cater different strengths and different abilities. You don't want to have options that are very similar to each other, like the ones that I have right now. Because for this session, it was quite a difficult task for me to think of options for this activity. But when you work with students, try to think of options, especially the process options, to cater to different strengths and different learning styles. Thank you, Chelsea and Caroline, for sharing. I really appreciate that. Would anybody else like to raise their hand and share anything? Yes, and the students, Caroline, thank you for your comment. The students will really enjoy seeing each other's efforts, and they're curious about what other students chose. And like, because everybody will choose slightly different option, the lesson is a lot more engaging and a lot more dynamic, even for you as a teacher. Because if you ask all 30 students to complete the same task and give a 1 minute or 2 minute presentation, it can get quite tiring listening to the exact same presentations, the very similar ones. But if you have a variety of activity, not only your students, but you yourself will enjoy that lesson, and everybody will benefit. And everybody will achieve the lesson objectives regardless of what options they chose for their lesson. Fantastic. All right, we have a few more minutes left. So let me see what I have here. I just wanted to once again remind you about the benefits of the strategy. Academic choice supports children's motivation to learn. It gives students opportunities to, what we just talked about, to appreciate each other's strengths and ideas. And more importantly, address a range of skills, address a range of learning styles, strengths, and interests. When I share this strategy with teachers, very often they say, well, great idea, I don't have time for that. I don't have time to plan all of these different activities. I don't have time in my lesson to incorporate all of these different activities. It's important to kind of think about it, that the academic choice, it's not an add-on. You already have a lesson planned. It's you very often you don't need to create additional resources for that lesson. You just need to think how you will allow your students a little bit more power and a little bit more autonomy in the class. And it doesn't mean more work for you. It doesn't necessarily mean more work for you. Can be, but doesn't have to be. Again, as a teacher, you can decide what options you give them. And again, as even Chelsea provided in her message earlier today, she already has a lesson plan for the next week. So now she doesn't need to make any changes to the resources. She just needs to think of the different process choices she can give her students to complete the already pre-selected task. And well, ask AI for help if you don't have time to even think about all of the different options. I personally use Poe AI bots, but there are, you can use absolutely any AI bot to help you with this task. What's important with these very specific strategies is to set it up first. What I usually do, I usually provide an example of an activity. So here I provided an example of an activity that was designed using the academic choice strategy. And then I told the bot, please remember this information and use this structure every time I request you to design activities using the academic choice approach. So now it remembered that strategy. And after that, you can ask it, please design the activity using the academic choice strategy for the following lesson objective. And here I use an example with the past simple tense, with the grammar-based lesson. And there you go. It uses the same structure as you asked it to. It provides you what options, it provides you how options, and some very creative activities. Actually create a timeline of historical events, write a short play, write a newspaper article, a gallery walk. In terms of process options, we have presentations, of course, an easy one, gallery walk or peer performance, loads of different options, depending on your student level, class size, and other specifics of your context. You can also kind of add that here as well. You can specify, the proficiency of your students to make sure that the options the board presents are actually applicable in your context. But some of these AI bots these days are excellent tools for brainstorming. All right, and if you want to learn more about the responsive classroom approach, or specifically about the academic choice strategy, you can read an article if you prefer reading, or you can watch a short video about the academic choice in the classroom. So you can scan these QR codes right now or later when we share the slides with you to learn a little bit more about the strategy.